Hello and welcome to another of Iford Arts OperaShots. Today I'm chatting with brilliant opera director, collaborator, friend and long-standing Iford favourite, Jeff Clarke. Under the banner of Opera della Luna, or ODL as it's known, Jeff has been producing intimate, irreverent and usually zany small-scale productions of Gilbert and Sullivan, comic opera and operetta for just over 25 years. His shows have attracted a loyal cult following, led from the front by ODL's Lunatics, a brilliant name for their friend scheme, and Jeff has won plaudits from audiences and critics for his wonderfully unique take on the repertoire. Iford Arts has been lucky enough to be a small part of ODL's journey, and I'm thrilled that Jeff is joining me today. Hi Jeff, how are you?
I'm very well, Ollie. Can I correct you on one thing?
Yes, do.
Which is that Iford Arts has been a large part of our journey, not a small part.
Well, I was just trying to be a little bit modest, but it's been, I know that your association with Iford Arts has gone back a long way, but I want to go back a little bit further than a long way to where it began for you. Where did you first get your bug from for not only opera, but for wanting to direct?
Oh gosh, that's a long story. I've got to go back a long way. I started in opera by being very fortunate to be taken on as an assistant by a very respected but idiosyncratic director called Anthony Besh, who is sadly no longer with us. And he took me to Australia as his assistant. And this was way back in 1982. And when I came back, I gave up a very good job in the House of Commons, actually, to pursue my dream of working in opera. And this chance came up and off I went to Australia. When I came back, I had no work. And whilst I was waiting for jobs to come up in opera companies as an assistant, because I was obviously still working as an assistant director then, I did all kinds of things. And in Australia, because I could play the piano, I'd earned some money being a rep, playing for Cossey actually in Brisbane. And so I started doing MD jobs in theatre, and the experience of working with actors rather than singers was quite life-changing in a way, because I realized that actors, certainly then, and I think it's still true now, approach the work in a completely different way than singers do. Singers will arrive on the first day of rehearsal knowing every note with a very clear perception of what their character is about and how they're going to play it, and they'll have done a lot of homework. Actors will have read around the subject and explored the world of the play, but won't actually know a note or a word of it on the first day of rehearsal. That's the process that happens during the rehearsal period. And the whole way of doing that is quite changing in quite dramatic in its, if you forgive the pun, in its way of approaching the work. And I conceived a way that I wanted to approach opera pieces, or opera with dialogue, with actors working in this way. And so I started a very small company we didn't incorporate ourselves. It was literally, somehow we were able to have a bank account, but it was a group of actors that I pulled together and called the English Players. And because we were actors rather than singers, and we were doing everything in English. And that was really the start of Opera della Luna. And when I did get jobs in opera companies like at Covent Garden and at the Scottish Opera, I brought singers into this ensemble and carried on exploring this world of a different repertoire, but a different way of approaching the work. And that's what eventually transmogrified into Opera della Luna.
I know you assisted other great directors like David Pountney and Jonathan Miller. Did any of their work inform how you work now?
They all do. You learn a little bit from everyone, I think, that you come across, even when people, and I'm not talking about directors now, but even when you go and see a production, and if in your world it's bad, you still learn from it. You still go and see, you know, I still go and see things and say, well, I wouldn't do it like that, and you know, that didn't work, and thank God they made the mistake, not me. But yes, and actually you couldn't have two more diametrically opposed directors than Anthony Bash and Jonathan Miller, who were completely poles apart in terms of the way they approach the work.
Did they have a specific take on how they approached comic theatre? Because I know you once said if you try to be funny in comic opera, you'll fall flat on your face, but play the truth, and then it'll be funny in itself. Is that something that is hard to achieve when you have music dictating pacing and timing?
Obviously, that clearly depends on how it's written and you know, the composer's take on the comedy, which is why so many so-called comedies, you know, are often not funny in opera. Yes, it is difficult when the music dictates the pace, but I think you've just got to trust that and go with what the composer's written. But the point you made, the first one, is the most important one, and I don't quite know where I gleaned that from. It's certainly something that is very much, it was in Miller's rationale, that you always go for playing the truth and looking for the truth and the reality of a situation, however ridiculous and unlikely it is, rather than imposing a piece of business or, you know, some kind of artificial structure on it. You
may not agree, but I've sort of always felt that comic opera has been unjustly neglected in the UK, more so than in other countries in Europe. And I was thinking, well, do comic operas show up too much of the British psyche of attitudes of, you know, class and authority, and perhaps those foibles haven't changed for us, and it's too much like looking at ourselves. When you look at Albert Herring, or you look at a dinner engagement, that sort of comedy is quite arch now.
Yeah, but I don't know whether I agree with you that we don't like laughing at ourselves. I mean, that's the whole key to Gilbert and Sullivan's huge success, is that they sent up every British institution or rather Gilbert did, that he could. But people lapped it up, you know. I mean, he was pointing out in, oh God, when was Iolanthe written? I don't know, 1882 or something like that. How ridiculous it is to have a hereditary house of peers. And yet, you know, we still haven't shaken that off completely. You know, and having bishops, he was prevented by D'Oyly Carte from making fun of the church and pointing, and wasn't allowed to say in Iolanthe that it's ridiculous to have bishops in the House of Lords. But you know, he was making those points, and yet it was phenomenally successful, and people loved laughing at these ridiculous things.
How did your audience take to being presented with GNS turned on its head? Because clearly the GNS audience is one that is very loyal, and they will know exactly what they expect to hear.
Well, they are loyal, but actually they by law, I think what you mean is they are traditionalists. There's a whole school of people that only want their Gilbert and Sullivan in the traditional D'Oyly Carte way. But that has changed a lot, actually, I think, over the last, I don't know, when did the copyright expire? 82. Well, the D'Oyly Carte closed in 82. The last 40 years, they have changed a lot. And actually, people who have claimed that they are traditionalists have also said that they loved what we did, because I think the thing about what we did, it was born of a love of the piece and a desire to make the piece work in a specific set of circumstances, you know, on a reduced scale, because we simply couldn't have a chorus of 24 and an orchestra of 30 and, you know, play a large set. And rather than, you know, sending the piece up because we didn't feel that it held up on its own. So there's a slight, you know, there's a kind of subtle difference between those two approaches. And I think people really cottoned on to the fact that we love the work. The whole thing, I have to say, was a complete accident, because our first production as Opera della Luna was Offenbach's Robinson Crusoe, which we had done as the English players. And then we chose it, although we named the company after Il Mondo della Luna, which we had done as the English players. The first actual performance as Opera della Luna was Robinson Crusoe at the Bloomsbury Theatre. And unfortunately, we hit on the same weekend, a train strike, a bus strike, and whatever other means of transport there were. And nobody could get there. And we lost £8,000, which in 1994 was a lot of money. And we had to make this back quickly. And one of the ideas that my partner at the time came up with was a Gilbert and Sullivan Gala, you know, 5 people in evening dress standing around a piano. And I said, well, okay, we'll do it. But it really depressed me. Not that I didn't want to do Gilbert and Sullivan, but I didn't want to do, you know, people standing with scores and all that kind of stuff. And in putting the program together, I kind of worked out that what I thought would be nice would be to do a selection from various different operas, and then in the second half just concentrate on one opera and do as many things as we could from that opera. And I worked out that Pirates lent itself to people doubling and playing more than one role. And then that kind of idea started, and I just thought, I wonder if we can just do a potted version of the whole of Pirates with, it was originally supposed to be 5 people, and then we found the money to add 1 and made it 6 people. And obviously we cut some numbers like Cat Like Tread, but I worked out that we could do the whole of Pirates more or less. And we costumed the whole thing on £250 from charity shops. And it was done for 3 performances, 2 at the theatre in Chipping Norton and 1 at the Corn Exchange in Newbury, which were local venues that I had done a lot of work at. And that was all it was supposed to be. And it's just one of those kind of lovely stories that everyone went crazy for it when they saw it. And we actually did it last year. We've done it nearly every year in our 25 years, but we actually did it again last year for our 25th anniversary.
It is amazing how, you know, budgetary constraints focus the mind. And I think have become an absolute master of recreating many productions, not only through your own translations with their very own take on your production itself, but making you focus on the drama in a much more microscopic way, which is in many ways what Iford Arts is. It's about producing opera in an intimate way. I mean, your first show with Iford Arts was in 2003, and you've been a regular collaborator and you've built up an amazingly loyal following over the years. How did you get involved?
Well, I came into the office. By 2003, we're actually very grand to have an office, and I had a lovely lady called Sue, who was my administrator, come assistant, come office person there. And I came into the office one day, and she was on the phone to a lady, and she just kind of put the phone on. She said to me, "Would you like to do a performance in a cloister?" And I said, "Well, we'll go anywhere if they pay us enough, or you know, what, tell me more." And she said, and then she said, "He says he'll yes, he's interested." And then she said, "There's a well in the middle of it." I said, "Yes." So, anyway, Sue couldn't. This lady was very keen to talk to Sue, so this conversation went on for quite a long time, persuading Sue that we ought to go down. So I went down to Iford to have a look at this space and met Judy and John and Elizabeth Hignett. And I'll never forget it. They took me up the garden and to show me the cloister. And I went in and I just burst laughing, because the whole idea of doing a show, we've done some crazy things in our time, but the whole idea of doing a show in this space, it was quite preposterous, really. And so preposterous that it really intrigued me. But what actually did impress me was that these people were deadly serious about it. Not in an, I mean, they were fun loving. Obviously, it was. I got the impression straight away that it was going to be fun. But when I say they were deadly serious, what I mean is they were completely committed to it. And we'd done, I mean, over the years, we'd survived by doing country house opera. And I wrote a song about it once, you know, we're going to build an opera house like all country folk do. We've a large garden shed, or the stone barn instead. Yes, it's even got lights and a loo. We'll do magic flute. It'll be such a hoot, with a break for some bubbly and salmon on croûte. I'll feed all the singers on baked beans and fish fingers. Oh, let's build an opera, build an opera, build an opera house. And it goes on. Louise Crane and I do it as our party piece, and it goes on, this 3 verses. Clearly, Iford was not at all like that. And there was just something about it which was so crazy. I just thought we've got to be part of this, because it's just so crazy, this whole idea of trying to put on a theatre production in a folly like that.
Well, I mean, the production brought in 2003 was amazingly crazy. Belle Hélène, wasn't it? And it went down an absolute storm. And there may be elements of that show which may have been a shock for our audience. They were not just a few 4-letter words, and there's a topless mezzo at one point, and I think at the end you had the cast handing out Viagra to the audience in the final act. Were you intending to shock?
No, I wasn't. I was intending to do just exactly what I thought was right for the piece, and I hadn't known Belle Hélène very well before that time, and it wasn't at all by any kind of intention to shock, but I was fortunate in that I had no concept of what the expectations were. I hadn't met the Iford audience, and to be frank, I just thought that this was a one-off, you know, and I just saw it as an opportunity to have a lot of fun doing a piece which I was really enjoying, doing it in my way. And you know, if they booed and hissed, or there were letters to the management, I didn't really care, because I didn't really expect to be going back the following year. But
well, it turned out that this is the beginning of an amazing sort of Offenbach idyll at Iford, and you and Judy Eglinton put together an amazing series of operas: Robinson Crusoe 2004, Tales of Hoffmann, Vie Parisienne, and most recently Orpheus in the Underworld. But what particularly attracts you about Offenbach as a composer? Because some people can be a little bit sniffy.
They can indeed be sniffy. I still think he's hugely underrated and misunderstood as a writer. I think he had amazing freedom and an amazing sense of humor. There's a great joie de vivre there, a love of naughtiness, a celebration of life as it really is, and not as it should be, and to destroy pompous, you know, over reverence of so many things, you know, that sending up classical legend, he in his time was considered a terrible transgression, but why not, you know, anything's up for satire.
We've spoken a bit about what may be particularly English in humor. Do you think particularly French in the humor of Offenbach operas?
Well, yes, but an awful lot of Offenbach is not only misunderstood, but that whole reinterpretation, the whole can-can thing. The trouble with Offenbach is that his music was then used by these nightclub places like the Folies Bergère and the Moulin Rouge for what became known as the French can-can in the beginning of the in the early 1900s, which is nothing at all. I mean, all those girls doing that with their skirts and whooping and all that nonsense. Offenbach wouldn't know what the hell was going on with that, because that's not what he wrote the gallops for in the operas. And so one has to be careful that one isn't imputing to Offenbach things that actually came much later. But, you know, everything comes around, even humor and fashions. And so much of Offenbach's humor is echoed in much more modern British humor. And there's a company in France called the Compagnie des Brigands, which are a kind of French opera de la lune, and they do a lot of Offenbach and Hervé and wonderful productions, which I went to Paris to see. And I met the artistic director, a guy called Loïc Boissier, and we were talking. My French is passable, and I can do the translations and all the rest of it. But in having kind of intellectual conversations, it can be moments when you think, what the hell is this guy talking about? And he kept saying the l'humeur Monty Python. And I didn't know what this word meant. And I thought, when I get home, I'm going to have to get my dictionary out and look out what the word Monty Python means. Well, halfway through the conversation, I realized that Monty Python was his pronunciation of Monty Python. And he was talking about Monty Python's sense of humor. But he was absolutely right, because that kind of, you know, Ministry of Silly Walks and all the humor that the Pythons encapsulated in the 70s is very much what Offenbach was laughing at, or the way he was laughing. And that humor, I don't know what it was about the early 20th century, maybe the wars and everything, but that humor just kind of didn't read to the British at all.
For many of our audience, actually, you brought Daughter of the Regiment, and for them it went on to sell out at Iford, and it subsequently sold out at Buxton too. It's a huge success, and you had Marie's regiment as Hell's Angels and leather on motorbikes. Where did your idea for that come from?
You know, it often happens when you're commissioned to do something that I would never ever have chosen La Fille de Regiment as a piece to do, and that was Judy's choice. Judy, I don't know how well she knew the piece, or whether she had an eye to the success that it had had at Covent Garden with the Diego Flores and Nathalie Dessay production, which had caused a huge stir. And, you know, that production had been a huge success. And I think the combination of Donizetti and, you know, a French opera comique, or, yeah, appealed to Judy. So she said, I want you to do La Fille de Regiment. And I thought, oh my God, how can we do that? You know, how can you have the principal problem being, how can you have a regiment of soldiers on stage at Iford? I mean, you know, even in a ordinary opera house or a stage, you need hundreds of chorus to make it look like a regiment. Otherwise, it just looks like Dad's army or something. And I didn't want to do that. You know, that's the fine line between doing what we do and sort of apologizing for the fact that you've only got a small company and a small stage. The last thing I wanted to do was, you know, do that old gag about you six come with me, the rest of you wait out there, and have 6 soldiers on stage to represent a regiment. I just thought, no, I can't, I'm not going to do that. And so I started thinking, what else could a regiment possibly be other than hundreds of soldiers? And I at first I thought maybe it's the name of some kind of, you know, last of the summer wine derby, and old guys, OAP, like the men that go bowling and meet every Wednesday night for a pint or something. But I thought that doesn't work all the way through the piece. It would be fun if those were the regiment and they were all old kind of codgers. But it didn't you know, it didn't kind of go through the piece. And and somehow I made the leap from there to it being the Hells Angels group, because the whole Hells Angels story and the whole story of the rise of biker groups is a very interesting one, because it started when soldiers came back from GIs came back from the war after the Second World War, and were suffering, all kinds of mental stresses and post-traumatic syndrome, we would call it now, but loss of camaraderie and loss of identity, and they weren't in the regiment or their company anymore, and so they formed these biker groups as a kind of male bonding, testosterone fueled outlet for all the post-war angst. And that's, I've got books up here actually about the whole rise of those biker groups, and it does have this military connection. And as I explored that idea, then as opposed to the old Codgers idea, so many things about the story fell into place, that they could have found the child, and a lot of them had clubhouses where some of them actually lived if they didn't have families themselves. And it kind of, it's just one of those happy ideas when you latch on something that works.
I was looking at when we first worked together, and it was in 2005 on a production of Rusalka, and I count up, we actually worked together on 8 further productions since then. You've spoken a lot about reducing works down, reducing casts, and Rusalka is clearly an opera that requires a lot of reducing. I remember we reduced the chorus of the ladies' chorus down to only 3 water nymphs, and we commissioned Ian Fang to do a wonderful reduction for us, which English touring opera subsequently used. And you hired a fantastic team. I mean, designer Elroy Ashmore that you've worked a lot with. I remember walking to the cloister, and he has created this amazingly murky, dark, subterranean world, and you actually weren't aware of where you were. Clearly, this was a huge departure from your usual fare. Was it daunting scaling down the opera so much?
I don't think so. I don't remember it being daunting. No, I mean, as with Daughter of the Regiment, it wasn't a piece I chose, and when you're suddenly presented with a challenge and a commission like that you will do this, that's something I enjoy in a very different way than something where I've decided I want to do this for whatever reason.
Well, I certainly remember getting to know the score, and it's a big romantic score. But actually, I was daunted initially, but when I delved a bit deeper, I've sort of found it was a little like La Bohème. You have a huge orchestra, but the composer, Dvorak, only chooses to use all the orchestra only at very few points in the score, and most of the score is gentle and lilting and so beautifully orchestrated that you don't need sheer power and force of scale from the orchestra. You need something a lot more textured and nuance. So as I got to know it, I was heartened, and we had a wonderful cast. We had a young Yvette Bonner. The translation you did yourself, and I remember thinking it must be so helpful to direct your own translation, so you can put your own particular slant and make the modifications to the scale of the translation with your production. And you're a superb translator yourself, so I imagine it's very helpful to be able to mold the production to the words that you want the singers to sing.
Yes, I suppose it must be. That's something I'm a bit unconscious of, to be honest. And I tend to be a little bit compartmentalized in my head about such things, because once the translation's done, which is obviously done quite a long time before you go into rehearsal, because then you have to hand it over to the singers to learn. And in that gap while the singers are learning it, I've kind of forgotten the process of the translation. So by the time I come to rehearse it, it's not fresh. It doesn't feel as though I've just done it, and it has that integrity, or it has that kind of joy that you're talking about. It always feels slightly as though it might have been somebody else's translation, but and people ask me, how long did it take? The question is, how long does it take you to do it? Well, I can never answer that question, because I can only say I did it over a period of 6 months or whatever. But of course, you're not doing it every day, and you can spend a day over 2 lines, and then you can do 5 pages the next day.
Like many composers who have composers' huts, do you have a translator's hut at the end of the garden?
No, but I tell you what, I always go away and, nearly always, and go and put myself in a different environment where I'm not at home and worrying about dealing with the post every day. For the last 5 years, I've been going in February and March to California. A friend of mine is lucky enough to own an apartment in Palm Springs, and I go there for 2 months.
I was thinking back to some of my favorite productions that we've worked on, and 2 of them, well, one of them was one that you translated, was the Lucia in 2006, and we had the wonderful Lorena Gore, who is now
big star in Australia.
The production you created was really arresting. I'll never forget the moment where you had Lorena singing into a mirror and in one side of the space, and the reflection that it caused, but also the way that the audience could either watch her or watch her in the mirror during the mad scene. And do you remember how we had to scour Europe to find a glass harmonica player?
Well, I never did any of the scouring. I was just astonished that you managed to find something, because that translation wasn't new, because I actually did the translation for Lucia for the 2nd year of Opera della Luna. We did it back in 1995, and we had a very different arrangement then. With a electronic keyboard, and I knew of the glass harmonica thing, but I don't think I'd ever heard. I must have heard it on a recording, but I'd certainly never been to a performance where the glass harmonica had been played.
I mean, I was wondering why Donizetti chose the glass harmonica as the instrument to show madness. And I read in an article, I don't know if it's true or not, that actually the glass harmonica players, because they're having to constantly lick the rims of lead glasses, themselves going slightly bonkers. The other production, actually, which is very dear to my heart, it's partly because I met my wife on the production, was the Rake's Progress we did in 2007. We've spoken a little bit about how you can adapt your translation to suit your production. The Auden Kalman text in Rake's Progress isn't an easy job for a director to make sense of. I remember we not only did it at Iford, but with Opera East, my company at the time, we took it to St Edmundsbury Cathedral. But was it hard making sense of that very, very dense Auden Kalman text?
I don't remember it being so. No, it was a hugely exciting experience. It's a fascinating piece. What I found sometimes more impenetrable was Stravinsky's music. He seemed, not that I didn't understand the music, but he seemed to make some odd choices of the style for surprising choices of style for some of the things that Auden had said.
It always struck me with the text that how all the text to do with the love music between Tom and Anne, Auden apparently made Kalman write that, because Kalman apparently wasn't hugely faithful to Auden, and Auden did everything else. And I wonder, because there are 2 librettists involved, whether or not a little bit like Candide, which we'll talk about in a second, where there are 6 or 7 librettos. Perhaps there are too many cooks.
Possibly. You know, it's a fascinating one, and I would hesitate before calling the Rake's progress flawed. But you know, pieces that have those idiosyncrasies in them are fascinating to work on.
I remember going to the John Soames Museum to see the Hogarth prints, and it was one of their evening visits where there's no electric light. It was all candlelight, and being very struck by the antique nature of these prints. And I thought, well, that's probably why the neoclassical style of Stravinsky works so well, a modernist's take on the Hogarth prints. And I thought David Hockney got it absolutely right in his brilliantly checkered design from Glyndebourne. But again, you had to create that production for so many different spaces, and we had to reduce the chorus down. And actually, I remember reducing the orchestra down. You can't reduce the winds and brass parts, but I reduced it down to single strings. And the crystalline nature of the score, I thought, worked fantastically well.
One of my biggest memories of that is going, while I was working on it and trying to come up with some kind of basic concepts around which to base the production. And I knew I didn't want to make it grounded in one particular period or another, that I wanted a fluidity of periods and references. And I was quite exercised as to how to reinterpret Bedlam. And you know, I remember very well the Hockney production. Was that John Cox or
John Cox? Yes.
Yeah, and the Bedlam scene with the, you know, all the mad people and the all that kind of deranged Marisad type acting, which you know, kind of was back to Peter Brook. But and I didn't want to do any. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to have, because you're too close to Iford for one thing, and having kind of people leering at you and behaving uncomfortably so close was something was an area I didn't want to move into. And I was quite exercised as to what I should be, how to do this. And I remember, for some reasons I've now forgotten, I was in Copenhagen, and I had to, I don't think we had, well, we must have had laptops. Anyway, I needed to do some emails and I didn't have anything with me. So, you know, there used to be these things called internet cafes. So I went into this internet cafe in Copenhagen, and there were all these people just doing this. And I kind of surreptitiously looked, and some were doing emails, but an awful lot of them were kind of second lifers and playing these games where they are going down caves and, you know, shooting monsters or doing, but there was a whole room of people just fixated on their screens and tapping away and doing what they're totally unrelated and disassociated from reality. And I just thought, this is hell, you know, where nobody talks to each other and we're all in our own world, that we don't communicate with anybody else, and everything that means something is fictitious on a screen. And that worked so well in Iford. If you remember, when we got to the Bedlam, they all came in with stools, and it was that internet cafe scene recreated, and Tom just couldn't relate to anybody within that world.
That production was almost a tripartite collaboration between Iford Arts, Opera East, and ODL. More recently, we've had a similar collaboration on Bernstein's Candide, which we produced together in 2018 as part of the composer's anniversary. ODL, Iford, and we took it to Cheltenham international festival. I suppose of any opera, Jeff, to scale down, this wouldn't be the most obvious choice. How many scene changes?
I've lost count of the scene changes, but there were 143 costumes.
And this was down to a cast of, well, a brilliant cast of 14. Paula Sides as Cunegonde, Rosie Ash as the mono buttocks old woman, and you brought in music theatre heavyweight Carl Sanderson as Voltaire Pangloss. I suppose this very much goes back to the early English player days when you were bringing in acting singers and singing actors. And I remember us talking about how much text there was for Voltaire. And how we were going to deal with that. And you came up with an ingenious idea to cope with that.
I think it's the idea of having different narrators. There's a piece I nearly directed many years ago called The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists by Robert Tressel. And it's about it's a sort of trade union text. And they're in the play, they are painting something, and the foreman is the kind of narrator. And during the working of the play, each one takes on the role of the foreman and for a scene or two, and then goes back to being an ordinary worker. And I thought that was a very fascinating idea of people playing a role for a certain amount of time and then somebody else playing the role, because you get different facets. And as long as the audience aren't confused by it and know, when that person is Voltaire and when he's the master of the jail, or whoever else he may be, I think it added something. It added variety rather than having one person coming on all the way through.
Well, for me, it was fantastic to be able to shift the spotlight and shift the focus rather than listening to your head teacher droning on for hours. It gave a different energy to the story and a different perspective to the story. And I thought it worked so well. I particularly remember too how you came up with the solution for having the 6 kings on their gondolas in Venice. What was your solution to that?
I've always had a thing about movement on stage, and that goes back a long way. I always used to love it in pantomimes when the dame came on a bicycle, or any kind of move, and particularly with movement, particularly with music that is very motivational or has a lot of movement in its rhythm. At the end of just to digress for a moment, at the end of Orpheus, sorry, not the end, at the end of the first half, when the gods all decide that they're going to go down to hell, you get this wonderful tune, dun, 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 and it's got such movement in it. And if you had a huge stage, you could do clever choreography and have people moving around, because it's so much here we're going, we're on the move, move type music. And I couldn't do that at Iford because there's nowhere to go in that tiny space. And out of that was born the concept of the circular bike, which I had made for Orpheus, which worked fantastically well at Iford, going round the well. And and I started to get, I realized if I'm not careful, I'm going to get branded by doing this, because then I had bikes in Door to the Regiment. But for the barcarolle in that Venice scene, similarly, I just felt that you needed gliding movement and people moving in a non-perambulatory way around the space. And so the only things that would go slow enough that you could get that effect were those little scooters. So that's kind of...
Well, I had half the orchestra looking round to follow what they were doing to make sure they could actually not run into each other, and I was slightly worried, of course, that they would lose their place in their scores by actually watching what they were doing. Since you've mentioned Orpheus in the Underworld, it seems a perfect opportunity to show our viewers a little clip of your production, Jeff. Tell us a little bit about where we are.
Well, there's two little clips I'd like to show you. One is a ballet right at the beginning. And just very briefly to put this in context, Offenbach wrote Orpheus in the Underworld twice. He did a version in 1858, which is the original. And then he rewrote it and added a lot of music in 1874. And a bit like Candide, where you can cherry pick, you know, or you can't in Candide, but there are different versions. And with Orpheus, nobody that I'm aware does the whole of the 1874 version because it's very long. And it's hard ever done the 1858 without including bits of the 1874 music. So there's all kinds of bits you can play around with. And there's a ballet in the 80s. The 1874 added a lot more ballet music. And right at the beginning, there is a ballet des bergères, where the shepherds are supposed to come in and do a little ballet dance with Orpheus, with Aristeus, who's Pluto in disguise as a shepherd. And I decided rather than have shepherds, it would be more fun to have sheep dancing. And so we've incorporated that music, that jolly music. And as I say, it comes right at the beginning. And at the beginning of the opera, you have Orpheus and Eurydice having a row and deciding to get divorced, which is a strange way to open a show. And even now, it slightly wrong-foots the audience because you open on a row rather than a, you know, kind of where are we, a gentle introduction. And then you get this rather kind of pastoral moment and lots of fun. So it really kind of settles the audience down, and it was a very effective early part of the show. So I'd like to just relive that ballet of the sheep, and then, as I've mentioned it, I'll show you again the wonderful bike at the end of the first act when they all go off to hell.
Well, I can't wait to see it. I've never seen it. Rupert Christensen clearly loved the show. He said he couldn't think of any production he's enjoyed so much. Jeff, it's been a real joy and delight to catch up with you, and I hope we'll get to see each other very, very soon. And I hope
so too, Ollie. Yeah.
Our audiences at Iford Arts will be able to enjoy more of your fantastic work. We shall leave you with the genius of Jeff and some excerpts from his Orpheus in the Underworld. Thanks, Jeff. Bye.
Bye.